Informed and educated people claim that Hitler and similar fanatics are all too alike to Donald Trump, how he speaks, acts, targets others, and more. To decide for yourself, it's best to look at the time of one past fanatic, Adolf Hitler.
In 1923, Adolf Hitler incited an insurrection against the government. He was tried, given a slap on the wrist, and became a convicted felon. Despite being treated charitably by the judge, Hitler claimed the trial was political persecution and portrayed himself as a victim of a corrupt party. Once in power, Hitler appointed wealthy, biased toward him in particular, oligarchs into key government roles. He proceeded to attack government setups and solidify support for the economic elite, having worked to ensure the working class was fractured along culture and ethnic lines. His mob, the Nazis, shut down workers' unions and abolished strikes, undermining human rights. Big business profits rose sharply from sudden policy changes instigated, and the working class grew more used to living paycheck to paycheck. Hitler wasted little time in undermining democracy and democratic institutions. Total loyalty wasn't just encouraged, loyalty was demanded, and those that didn't give it to him was tainted, not just an enemy to him, but an enemy of everyone and the state. Media that were daring to question his actions or even highlight them were also vilified as the enemy and further slandered. Hitler's propaganda man made sure to intimidate media sources into giving them either favorable coverage or sending a message that when none was given, there would be dire consequences. Media sources started to then censor themselves even more, deliberately leaving out vital information that would have been useful to the public so they could greater see Hitler and his goons in a more truthful light. Signing off on all matters, Hitler made it a priority that his goons tainted text-based materials that they did not particularly like as degenerate as false information and lies. They targeted what would be considered today as greater free thinking, free speech, or critical thinking liberal ideas. Hitler and his Nazi goons targeted libraries. They targeted bookshops. They targeted staff, while themselves also destroying or persuading a brainwashed public to do more destruction on what Hitler and his goons deemed wrong when it challenged their line of thinking, their warped ideology, or advanced a person's ability to carry out decent forms of critical analysis. In other words, Hitler and his goons wanted a more dumbed-down nation. Such a nation of people, if more created, Hitler and his Nazi goons knew, was then far easier to brainwash and mass control. Even before Hitler ultimately gained power, he cleverly promoted himself as the voice of the common man. He rallied against so-called elites, even though quietly it was his own rich elites that were also financially backing him. Hitler rallied against what he called the establishment, even though in fact he was using and exploiting the establishment to climb himself into greater power. Hitler claimed that the education system was wrong, that it needed to be dismantled and rebuilt again, in line with his and his goon party warped ideology, of course. In order to win over a public that was being brainwashed by him and his own elites, he swore to return his country to greatness again. This promise of returned greatness would be something that would also be copied by later wannabe dictators and warlords, from Pol Pot, Idi Amin, and yes, even Donald Trump. Hitler, once he gained power, further became far richer, albeit very quietly. While in office, he knew that he and his own elites, his oligarchs, would be able to get away with more if they continued to claim there was an enemy within, something that the mass public could be told existed and be distracted over. Anyone that was not in Hitler and his goons' favor were tainted as an enemy within. With the public distracted, Hitler and his oligarch elite ensured that they had their own handout for payments classed as contributions, when not given outright bribes, and also grabbed up parts of many businesses for themselves, often using the excuse of taking them over in the national interest. If any of the public felt there was anything odd or suspicious going on, the enemy within media propaganda was conveniently rolled out once more. It was always someone else's fault, never the fault of himself, his quiet operating in the background oligarchs or his Nazi goons who were also going around destroying other businesses they deemed as undesirable. In order to make his public fan base stronger, Hitler masterfully scapegoated minorities, blaming them over and over as being a source of his nation's problems. Hitler propaganda exploited societal divisions, causing division using a method of divide and conquer, alongside a constant us and them narrative. It was a narrative that was repeatedly dosed out to an all too gullible public. Too many brainwashed people swallowed his hate-filled bait. After all, they weren't allowed to be told any different, and by the time Hitler was an even higher power, those that dared to even start any critical thinking challenge were automatically deemed a liar and an enemy of the people and state. Opposition was then further street and even home targeted. When it came to targeting people, especially those Hitler and his goons didn't like or want existing, he passed a law that removed birthright citizenship from people long existing as legal citizens. Overnight, adults and children were suddenly stripped of their national citizenship. They were reclassed as being illegal. Then they were rounded up for transportation to elsewhere. Here, too, alongside Hitler, his party goons, and his own oligarch friends, the media that was now greater and harder bullied or bias-owned churned out propaganda over and over that the now deemed illegals were the ones that were the cause of everyone else's ills. The lower educated, the people that were kept more dumbed down, the deliberate lesser informed and more, all swallowed it up. After all, they were not allowed enough to hear anything different or anything that might nationally challenge Hitler and his own party propaganda. It was mass brainwashing at local and national levels.
Hitler and his party also took aim at the very women of his country. He and his jackboot-stomping male friends didn't like it that there was a growing female air of independence. They certainly didn't like it that women thought themselves as equal in regards to the same rights as men. In 1934, Hitler proclaimed the woman's world is her husband, her family, her children, her house. Hitler and his party saw to it that prior existing laws giving women equal rights were struck down and out. New laws were introduced to restrict females of all ages, what roles they could enter or do, but more shockingly, more laws were further introduced to restrict an adult woman or young female as to how she should have less rights over her own body. Reproductive rights in particular were severely restricted by Hitler and his male party members.
Now that you have been reminded of all this, it's also important to point out that Hitler's people at the time didn't have their own prior history example to learn from, as today's modern civilization can, and still must. Hitler's people were very much in the dark as to how they could be professionally manipulated. They simply didn't know any different, and those wishing to exploit them were not in any hurry to explain how they could be brainwashed, and then greater exploited. The people of Hitler's time just went along with the run of events alongside their own gullible brainwashing. They were conditioned to accept the created hatred of others. As Hitler's divide and conquer tactic continued, more and more lives were attacked, more minorities were targeted, more groups were wrongly blamed as the source of national ills, when nothing could have been further from the truth.
80 years on, people are globally comparing what occurred in the past because, alarmingly, it rings all too familiar to modern ongoing events. For clarity, let's summarize some past aspects. There was an insurrection tried against a government. It failed. Hitler was court-tried and became a convicted felon. Despite his very actions, he cried over and over, it was all political persecution. He ranted. He was the victim of everything. In power, He role-appointed those that previously looked after him. He used a divide-and-conquer tactic. He attacked those trying to protect human rights. Not only that, but he changed laws to the advantage of his own oligarchs. Big business profit rose sharply. The people became poorer. He undermined democratic institutions and national services. Total loyalty was expected, particularly toward him. Not agreeing made you an enemy within or an enemy of the country. Any media writing anything he didn't like was tainted as fake news over and over. Media were intimidated to capitulate and further back him and his party. They were deliberately made seen to also back him. In the face of defending the right to speak and even publish his own words, he same time sought to banish and destroy other people's works, targeting other texts, opinions, and books. Despite wealth, he imagined himself in PRR as a common person, rallied against elites despite being one of them and being backed by them. He was massively, but quietly, a part of the German establishment. He attacked education. He swore to return a greater nation in constant sales pitch. He too ranted about a constant enemy within. It was always the people that didn't swallow his propaganda and those that tried expose it. He mass-targeted groups of others. He massive stripped people of their German-born identity and birthright citizenship. They were classed as illegals. He called all opposition as all being liars. He was always the one supposedly telling the truth when his list of lies spouted grew by the day over years. He mass rounded up people and transported them in bulk elsewhere. Women's rights were reduced. He took massive money from his own oligarchs who were seeking favors and eventually got them. It meant for them, later, further greater profits. He and his party particularly went out of their way to target those that were of alternative sexuality persuasions. Targeting citizens, they censored any helpful materials, books, or other sources of possible help, while some were still coming to terms about who they were on emotional levels.
A last quick history reminder. There was a Munich, September 29th to 30th, 1938, political meeting of European leaders. At the meeting, those attending effectively capitulated to Hitler. They crazily decided to let him not only get away with what he'd done so far, but afterwards, still let him get away with even more. The Munich Agreement they created was a form of appeasement aimed at avoiding another war. It was a total waste of time. There was to be no appeasing. The then dictator was going to do whatever the hell he wanted, once it was further made clear to him that other nations were stupidly going to cower to him. A policy of appeasement only further emboldened a dictator and madman. In 2025, will modern-day leaders make the same stupid mistake? It already appears so. They have already started to come up with multiple PR excuses for their own cowardly appeasement indications and expressions shared to national and international media outlets. Other governments, other parties, other individuals in America, in Europe, and further afield, now have to decide for themselves if to capitulate, if to seek appeasement from a sex and fraud convicted felon criminal who has managed to creep back into a position of power. Will they all make the same mistakes of previous leaders, such as those at Munich in 1939? Or will they stand up against a modern evil, a bully, and his oligarch backers? World leaders now have to decide if they have courage and a strong spine to stand tall and united. Or are they going to capitulate and be seen to capitulate along with invented excuses to a criminal, a bully, a possible warped mind, and those that sickeningly back him